Hello, everyone. Welcome to the rebirth of the Building Foodtech podcast. We're starting back at episode 1 in a remote setting nowadays. We're here with my amazing co-host, Brad, and we're going to be talking about some of the great things that are happening in ag tech, but also a retrospective and a look back at the controlled environment agriculture industry and seeing where it's currently at. Where do we go from here and what can we learn from it? So, Brad, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. I'm excited to basically restart and get going on this journey with you.
Yeah, no, I'm excited. Excited to jump in.
Well, great. So, when I think about, controlled environment agriculture, a lot of great promise, a lot of excitement, and, tangibly, a lot of venture dollars going into that industry. And it kind of follows a similar trajectory with other industries that kind of have seen a meteoric rise, but also a very similar meteoric fall. And, some of the ones that are like top of mind to me would be like the 3D printing industry, VR, industries like that. And so I'd really love to pass it to you to kind of start the retrospective, like what went wrong with controlled environment ag, or maybe what's the current situation with it, and where would you say the industry is currently settling at?
Cool. Yeah, no, I mean, it's an interesting time to kind of revisit this industry. So I'll just jump right into it and, stop me if my monologue is getting too long in the tooth there. But yeah, I mean, as we dive into what is arguably the implosion of the controlled environment agriculture CEA movement, we've had a lot of the high flyers that a lot of people have talked about, raised hundreds of millions of dollars in capital, and they're collapsing at about one a month for a while there, sometimes faster. And it reminds me a lot of what's happened in the past. So the two things that come to mind are the dot-com bust, which I was a little young to really be able to internalize or remember too much of, but I was alive, and the clean energy collapse of like the 2010s. And it's fascinating to have been close to clean energy back then and be kind of living the controlled environment ag, collapse as it is. I mean, just to go through kind of the big dogs, the heavy hitters, the leaders from that boom cycle. You've got AeroFarms, they're bankrupt. You've got AppHarvest, they're bankrupt. You got Plenty, they're bankrupt. Bowery, they're bankrupt. I mean, I think those companies alone represented, a few $1 billion in capital raised. And, that's a sour note to hit. But I mean, I think what's been really interesting is, where are we now and where do we go next? I mean, the way I think about it is, between 2017 and 2022, you had approximately $3 billion invested in vertical farming and indoor ag, and obviously I was there. I was part of it. I raised a very small amount of that capital, relatively speaking. But at this point, somewhere in the vicinity of 70% of those companies have failed, have been sold in fire sales, or pivoted completely out of the space. So, I have my brain goes to a couple of analogies. CEA essentially is the dot-com bubble in a greenhouse. Like if you think about it, it's a pets.com in a climate controlled environment. And I think the fundamental drivers here are probably not too dissimilar. Where the dot-com companies, like a pets.com, Webvan, if you're a student of the game, you've heard these names and you know what we're talking about. They solve for market excitement, really not sustainable revenue, and that was exactly the same in CEA. A couple of the examples, are like AppHarvest, who I was very familiar with from the very beginning, built massive facilities, before proving really any type of profitable unit model, where it was just like, oh, if we build it, it'll work. Scale is going to solve all. And I think they were one of the ones that you could see, if you were inside, you could see it very clearly. This idea of prioritizing tech theater, of like, oh, let's show robot arms. Let's show these flashy whiz bang things over the boring but essential element of like logistics, distribution, unit economics. And I think, we could talk about those stories all day long, but at the end of the day, it wasn't just as in the .com era, it's not controlled environment that failed. And I mean, this has become sort of a trope within the industry now, just as in the .com era, like the internet didn't fail. The internet has been phenomenally successful and very lucrative. But it was a business model problem. The business models of the day failed. And, if we're looking for silver linings, which I think I like to, we're entrepreneurs, we're eternal optimists, like you think about what came out of that. It's like Amazon survived, Amazon's become a relatively big company. That obviously being sarcastic, they're enormous because they nailed distribution. They had margin discipline, but, a lot of the controlled environment ag players, they really tried to be the Amazon, but there was no Bezos. So, it just didn't work out.
Interesting. So I guess to the point of talking about like there was no Bezos, do you think it was a matter of poor execution or technology isn't there? Or, was there some form of silver bullet that someone could have found that made it work? Or is it just fundamental, structurally not something that was essentially sound?
I mean, there was no silver bullet. I think it was just structurally broken in terms of the amount it would cost to grow, especially like a head of lettuce, to sell it into the established distribution channels, the cost to distribute, and then what the customer's willing to pay. It was never really going to pencil out in this era. Now, that said, again, look back at, the .com bust. Things changed dramatically over a 20 some odd year period where certain elements of a web van, of a Kazoo, or, a pets.com, do work now. But the broad thesis just was flawed. There weren't unit economics. The tech wasn't actually there. The infrastructure, the distribution, and in many ways, like the market wasn't there either.
And as an outsider kind of looking in, I think fundamentally, and that's something that I reflected, thinking about vertical farming and what it's meant to do, I think that there were kind of two issues. One was just what problem are we actually solving, right? Was it a supply chain issue, or was there some form of, structural issue with how existing agriculture is working that near urban or, vertical in indoor farming could fix? Doesn't seem like I've heard a compelling argument as to what are structural issues with the existing for us to be able to replace it. Given that we can see from companies like Deere and, many others of these like farming equipment companies, there's a lot of massive technology and automation that's being driven by these companies to make outdoor farming work even better, right? With less people, with more automation, more reliable food supplies. And then you have companies controversially also going into bioengineering, genetic, kind of modification, GMO type foods, right? To help hit on kind of the biology end of things where, less chance of some sort of pestilence coming in and knocking out our food supply, causing famine, right? Which are really like the historic problems that are related to food, but just not something that necessarily like CEA is there to solve. And I think from a venture capital perspective, right, and from an investor and, trying to seek that, scale and Peter Thiel driving a monopoly for yourself, right? It might just be like, oh, we're going to try to bring tame the outdoors by bringing it indoors and allowing for us to control the profitability of food supplies closer to where these investors are. I feel like that's also kind of an undercurrent there.
Yeah. I mean, a way I would think about it is, in the CEA space, there wasn't a fundamentally really broken supply. Like you said, agriculture is pretty efficient. We get decent food, pretty cheap, all of those things. You know, to me, it was the application of tech before really evaluating the market, but that's kind of an oversimplification. I think more to like a startup, I guess, theory or mode to build is, if you build some tech that does something, the most disruptive or impactful way to apply it is to play a different game. So don't be like, oh, you know what we're going to do? We're just going to compete with the big field lettuce growers, on quality and cost, and they're always going to beat us in distribution. We're going to sell in the same places. We're going to be next to each other on shelves. Like what CEA kind of missed the boat on is, your classic startup maneuver of force the world to play a different game. And that's where you can really disrupt, change the market, change the whole perspective. That was never I don't want to say that was never the directive or the direction anyone was taking, but the large scale, capital intensive, become a monopoly, take over all of lettuce production type of outfits, they were trying to play the same game against players that had structural and fundamental advantages that their tech wasn't going to solve or displace. And so that, to me, is kind of like our biggest failing in the CEA space.
And I think that if you were to look for like structural issues with farming, right, some of it comes down to like, is there enough fertile land within a country to actually produce food, right? And that even to this day, that's still like a constraining factor for the food production of a certain country. Now, we're having a lot of conversations now in our country and around the world about globalism, right? And how, if one country can just export a bunch of food, then maybe it doesn't matter as much. But potentially now with the more protectionist world that we're coming into, perhaps that could have lended, maybe it's just wrong timing, right? That potentially, if the free flowing of food becomes a little bit more scarce, right, then we start impacting supply chains. Then we start having more inflationary effects that cause our food system to structurally break. Now, whether this is of our own doing and not something that, is the fault of the farm industry in general, that's something that's a debate for different people. But from just a technologist and from a startup perspective, right, perhaps this is an actual problem now, right? That in the United States, we don't grow bananas, we don't grow coffee, but perhaps in an indoor environment, just because of protectionism and things that are outside of, the common person's control, we're going to be affected by inflation and by lack of supply just because of these protectionist tendencies.
Yeah, I mean, we're so early days of this protectionist movement, and it's so chaotic right now that no one can plan. I mean, that takes, to build one of these facilities, to do any of these things takes so much time and money that who knows if it's going to be different in 30 days. Certainly could be different in 4 years, because none of this is being implemented, kind of at a law level, and so, I have a hard time thinking about that. One of the things that I think about in that space is, could it have just been wrong time for the right industry? I still don't think so. I'm coming back to, the idea that the fundamental thesis of applying technology to this market that, really was not ripe for disruption, and trying to play the same game as a very big entrenched industry with structural advantages was never the right play. I think one of the things that is interesting to point out is obviously, founding freight farms and being in the trenches of this for a long time. I talked to a number of farmers in the last few weeks, and the most fascinating part of those conversations was that every application of farming at the hyper local level, where like at freight farms, it was all about make so many different people successful farmers locally. And what's fascinating to me is that at the sort of regional and local level, each farm is so different. They run a different business model. The customer segments are different. More, one segment that's great for a farm in the Northeast is terrible in the Midwest. So each one is so unique that the local and the regional farms that I see on the network can do quite well, but they're not competing with big ag. They're doing something completely different and seeing some success with it. So there's no universal business model to say we're going to grow lettuce locally in every market and then replicate who we sell to, how we sell, how we brand it. It's very much a distributed element of success there, which I think is probably one of the more fascinating things. So like, again, to toot the horn of Freight Farms, you guys know I'm biased on this, so, no need to hide it. But the idea of being a pure play technology provider and then kind of getting out of the way of the capitalistic imperative and competition within a local market to force, whoever runs the tech and whoever uses your technology to do the best they can and make a good business, let 1,000 flowers bloom kind of thing. I think that's where things are going more and more. And this next rise of CEA, you're going to see a lot more of that, just more prudent business building, that take a look at what market are they selling into, who are they selling to, what's the best way to do it, do they have a comparative advantage versus the existing supply. So I'm hopeful there, but I do think it's going to be a completely different conversation in the next sort of wave of CEA.
From your current position, do you see any of like the Phoenix story rising from the ashes? Have you seen any companies that people should kind of keep an eye on and see?
To a certain extent, yes, but everybody's so hobbled right now because it's very much the third rail of every conversation is talking about controlled environment agriculture. But I mean, I would say, again, talk my own book, but it's the truth. Freight Farms is doing well relatively compared to the industry itself. And I think, again, it's that fundamental element of play a different game. Now that's hard unto itself. And, the opportunity there is the different models to be implemented and the different games to win have been more clearly defined. So you've got some players in the, I'll call it like smaller scale space. Like there's a company like Babylon Farms, Fork Farms. There's a few others, like really strong companies, really interesting, hardware products that are more for, a kitchen demonstration or a home or something along those and then you've got your sort of mid-size modular scalable, like a Freight Farms that can be a standalone farm, can be a building block amongst others, all the way through your massive greenhouse with a tech-enabled system, Gotham Greens, Little Leaf Farms, a personal favorite, that are sort of, again, just segmented and saying, hey, like a purpose-built application of this technology for this market works. And so we're going to go at it. Is there going to, pie in the sky, you know what I'd love to see? I'd love to see one sort of run away with it a little bit, and then be in a position to say, hey, you know what, like we should, combine these companies, share best practices, because each element has some really cool tech that is really powerful that might benefit the other. Bring it all together under one roof, and create a really interesting company. But for that to happen, we need a few more years of runway for one of those leaders to break out, and recognize and, nail one channel before you start talking about rolling up other companies and bringing in other tech.
And do you think, and I wish, kind of funnily enough, that we could like phone a friend right now. This would be an opportunity to bring like Dave Harris over at Freight Farms to have discussion, because he's more embedded on the biology side of things. But do you think there's some form of technological innovation at some point in the future that could be a major boon, break the numbers, if you will, into the favor of CEA working better? Like, is there a way to genetically engineer vegetables that require less light, or a different, a cheaper bulb, right, a light bulb, or fusion energy comes in and suddenly it's super easy to run one of these facilities at an affordable cost, that type of thing. Or just in general, like, maybe it's just philanthropy, right? And that, it's just, hey, we just want to create an abundance of food that eventually becomes cheap. And so there's only a certain amount of land out there to be able to accomplish the goals of like abundance, oversupply of food that's philanthropic in nature. And so we need to start capitalizing on indoor. I'm just wondering, like, is there a way to be able to like flip the board in some way with some piece of technology that can help us kind of move the industry along and make the numbers work?
I mean, the short answer is yes to all of it. Like if we had some incremental progress, or even a breakthrough in half of the areas that you touched on, yes, it would change the game. If you had small reactor fusion energy on site that eliminated, a huge burden of ops costs, which is electricity. If we could, commercialize growing plants without light, which is a thing, but requires a whole different degree of systems engineering, that would change the game. I think we're really at that point, and this is one of the things I'm excited about is these companies that have survived have done so because they continue to iterate and make progress. And so right now you're not seeing the flashy headlines because no one really wants to talk about it. I know that's kind of like my mood around freight farms is I'm like, I don't really want to talk about it because so many good people who did a lot of great work, went bankrupt, went out of business, are going through a lot of pain. So it's not a time to make, claims, especially not things that don't have commercial viability yet, but are close. But I think, those behind the scenes, off the record conversations you have with the different companies, there's a lot of sort of tempered excitement of, hey, we've had a combination of breakthroughs where it's the right genetics on the plant, the right nutrition mix, the right climate recipe with, the right intensity and energy use around lights to get really, really compelling yields that make the kind of like that four-wall economic model of a farm very, very compelling, super competitive, and so again, it's the incremental improvements there are happening behind the scenes. I think what we're going to need to see that breakthrough is we just need the network of technical growers to continue to grow. The big ones, yes, they went out of business, they went bankrupt. The hyper local small regionals that are doing their thing, whether they're building DIY systems, whether they're standing up greenhouse with a technical advantage, or buying freight farms, or another type of technical solution, need to continue to go. And as that network grows, that's where you'll start to see some of these breakthroughs. It's the kind of thing where, whatever it was, like with social media, it's like, well, if nobody has the internet, you can't really have an online community. And so you could launch it, but if 50 people have computers that are internet connected, your maximum is 50. Fast forward, 10, 12, 15 years, all of a sudden you could have billions. And so I think getting more nodes on the network that are technical growers that are seeing moderate to high level success in their local market, that's when these breakthroughs are really going to have that, oh my gosh, CEA is just working kind of thing, where, to me, it's harkens back to like the clean energy bubble back in the 2010s where it was like, oh no, solar's never going to work. Clean energy is never going to work, because there was some, high flying public failures, but the industry itself, energy was always going to be a need. So it just kept moving forward, improving incrementally to the point where now you look around and go, wait a minute, is it cheaper to produce renewable energy than, some of our traditional plays? Oh, wow. Yeah. Oh, that's great.
I'll give you another opportunity, Brad, to, talk your own book and maybe put on a different hat, your Morrissey Market hat, and just kind of talk about like what the impact potentially of food as medicine could have within CEA. I just think that, like, one of the things that I think about when trying to do go to market is, look, if the broad consumer and a B2B doesn't work, there's generally the last option, which is going up market, right? And trying to make some form of a premium product to hopefully
Mm-hmm.
establish market exposure, right? And some sort of product market fit inside of this more premium, more space to maneuver market, to then allow for you to figure out, have more income to do R&D on a potentially mass market solution that doesn't require pouring in copious amounts of venture capital, but just to have a fundamentally strong base. The kind of bootstrapping movement that we're seeing being like a really strong undercurrent in the startup community nowadays. Just thinking about, like, can people afford to go upmarket potentially with food as medicine, or some form of application of that, in order to allow for super customized food, for example, like, hey, this person has a vitamin D deficiency, so we're going to be able to have genetically bred super lettuce that is loaded with vitamin D, and that could be an application of, whether it be a freight farm system, indoor farming, greenhouse,
Mm-hmm.
whatever, right? To create these really customized food products that, a large farm, more for scale, won't necessarily be interested in doing. And that's kind of the like gap in the armor where you kind
Mm-hmm.
of attack.
Yeah. Yes. Again, the eternal optimist, the answer is yes. I don't see it anytime soon, and I'll try to build my case to why not now, why not soon, but why yes someday. When it comes to food as medicine, one of the things we're trying to solve at Morrissey Market, and are starting to get some really good traction around doing so, is having food prescribed to the same level of efficiency, clarity, and effectiveness, and just data as pharmaceuticals are prescribed to battle disease and sickness in the broader sense. So step one is really being able to put large scale evidence behind the application of this food, which represents these nutrients, all the other elements of how the body absorbs those nutrients, uses those nutrients, affects the outcome of a patient's health with a specific disease state. We're just at the early innings of that. It's still very much like just throw a big old bucket of food at it, and that's somewhat better. But how much of what? A little bit better is better than no better. I don't even know if that statement makes sense, but that's kind of where we're at. The analogy I use in the industry is we're right at the cusp of transitioning from the apothecary era of pharmaceuticals to real data-driven, R&D-driven pharmaceutical care. So like in the apothecary era, if you had a good apothecary, if you're not familiar with an apothecary, they were the ones who actually mixed the different concoctions and medicines that were prescribed by your doctor. And some of them were great, some of them just weren't. So the efficacy of the application was all over the map. And so it was really hard to calculate. One of the first things that big pharma did, that we know as we know them today, is to unify and uniformly apply the supply chain. So like start with something like an aspirin, where it's like, okay, it's being mixed in all these apothecaries, but to varying degrees of potency and effectiveness and all these other things. We're going to formalize that, standardize that, and then run tests against that, so that as it gets applied, it's like, oh, this does work. This is great. It relieves my pain, whatnot. And the doctors then have the ability and the confidence to say, use this, take this, it does this. We're nowhere near that in food. We'll get there. And then it becomes a matter of, what's the ROI on a specialty grown lettuce, for instance, that is, super high in iron or super low in iron or what have you. And is it the most effective and cost effective and efficient manner to control that disease state? Is it the lettuce, or is it a matter of, take an iron supplement straight up? There are differences in the way the body absorbs, a supplement versus, an element of food that's ingested in that way. I don't know the science on that, but again, until there's an apples to apples comparison to be made, no one will know, and no one will study it, and no one will develop a business or technology to make it happen.
When I think about a lot of these things, right, as you're kind of discussing about like taking in the supplement like in a pill format, or like just having it in a salad or whatever, my mind just started going like, can I just get like a burger and like just have it loaded with all the vitamins that I want, because the beef or the lettuce and the tomatoes inside of it's just chock full of my doctor prescribed vitamins that I need. Like, I took a blood test, they was able to figure out, okay, you're deficient here, here, and here, and like, here's the food from some form of vendor out there that will be producing the type of vegetable that you're necessarily going to need, and then poop all into some form of natural food format, probably something a little bit healthier than a cheeseburger, but whatever the equivalent is, to be able to be like, you're getting whatever you need now in this. And maybe that's a little bit of another industry that's kind of floundering right now. I'm thinking of like the meal prep industry, right?
Yeah, I think I'm going to jump in and kind of stop you right there. Because I think I would disagree with not disagree with. I think your fundamental premise is not flawed, but I would say it's outdated. In that, what kind of got us into this mess is the idea of fortifying real food with supplements as the solution to. And now we're in this whole world of hurt, because according to the way different regulations have been written, et cetera, you can't advertise a head of lettuce, an apple, a whole, fresh, healthy piece of food as part of a heart healthy diet. The same way you can Cheerios and Fruit Loops and whatnot, because they're fortified with folic acid. So now they're part of a heart healthy diet. And so I think that system of, can we take the food and fortify it so that yes, it has benefits. It's almost the continuation of we're just too good at what we do sometimes, in that 60 years ago, when the food system was all under pressure about just get people calories and get them vitamins so that we're not starving, then growing more food by any means necessary, fortifying food with vitamins and things because huge populations were deficient in that specific vitamin, was phenomenal. The problem is, we kind of hit the success point. The industry hit the finish line, won the race, crushed it, and then just kept running for another 20 years to a point where it's just gotten ridiculous. And so I think that's where, the future system will break from this idea of, because you're not wrong. Like, if it keeps running, you're going to get a cheeseburger that actually on the whole is terrible for you, but it's fortified with all the things that you're deficient in, and, is part of a heart healthy diet.
I think that's a good way of kind of clarifying some of the misnomers related to it, right? Like, I could have a T-bone steak, and it's the beef has somehow been genetically modified to have all the vitamin A, D, C, whatever, right, that I need in order to, for the day, right? The calorie count, the whatever, it's been already factored in. But you're saying like that's not the thing that we necessarily need to be focusing on. An interesting perspective, right, as we kind of wrap up this conversation is, I often think about, like, as someone who's kind of trying to be a home cook and learning more how to cook, and results may vary from that, but just thinking about, like, aspiring and really like trying to learn from how like Michelin starred restaurants kind of formulate their food, right? It's all about high quality ingredients, and all their portions, maybe that's a cost thing, but generally really smaller portions, right? And for the rich and wealthy individuals, right, that produces a great diet for them whenever there's special occasions, or presumably their private chefs are crafting food in that way. I'm wondering if it's more on that level, and when we start thinking about doctors diagnosing what are our issues, and then allowing for nutritionists, software systems, AI systems to be able to say, this is holistically, holistically in the sense of like, from all of our nutrients that we need, what calories we're taking in, and what food is available to us, this is how we can craft the best possible diet. And I guess kind of looking at food as medicine in that format, just to wrap everything neatly in a bow, is that kind of what I'm interpreting. That's kind of the world that you're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there, but I think to the point of we'll get to that state where you can be quantified in terms of you run a blood test, you say my metabolic system responds in this way to different things, specific food elements, nutrition, and then prescribe that nutrition. And I think that's the right way to go about it in the clinical setting to fight disease. I think it's a terrible idea for just you and I broadly. I mean, I think if that's a path you chose to go down, if you want to get very, very, very healthy, that's great. So I think in the clinical setting, that's where we'll get to. Again, the infrastructure has to be there so that you can match a blood test to a specific application of food. We're just not there yet. All the parts are possible. They just haven't been connected yet. That's what we're trying to do a little bit on the Morrissey side, and so I think we'll get there, and I think that's broadly the right direction and where we'll take things. But I think I think a fundamental flaw in the question itself is that when you go to a restaurant, that chef is cooking for flavor, not for health. So if you go in the kitchen, you're like, why does the steak at the restaurant so good? And when I try to make it at home, it's it's okay. And then you're like, well, I'm discounting the 2 pounds of butter that went in to make that steak so delicious, which again, it has an application. It's delicious, and you should be able to eat those things, but it's a whole set of problems that have to be unwound there.
Interesting. Well, there's a whole load of can of worms there that we can open up and have a discussion on, but I think we've had a really great kind of full circle conversation about the controlled environment agriculture, CEA industry, a little bit about how food as medicines pays potentially an off-ramp for the industry to progress on as a whole. Brad, thank you so much for giving a lot of your insights for this episode. Do look out, audience, for a lot of really great content that we're going to be having in the future. Some interviews with some friends of ours that are in the agriculture industry, hopefully to just allow for more people to be interested and understand more a industry that a lot of people have a bucolic kind of image of, right? And something that we try to help dispel. So, Brad, thank you so much. Is there anything that you'd like to discuss what you're working on that you'd like to promote here at the end?
No, I mean, nothing to promote. I think I got a good plug for Morrissey and my mentality there. I think just the closing thoughts really around the idea, when it comes to CEA, we're not seeing the death of CEA. It's just kind of the end of that first phase of that naive phase. And for the founders that are building, there's not going to be a lot of, and don't try to build the next unicorn lettuce farm. It's not going to happen. So let's just sort of put that baby to bed. We want to be building the systems that connect food, the health system, and the end customer in a very holistic way, like you said. So those are the things I'm excited about. So if you're a founder working on those, I want to meet you and just say hi and say I met you way back in the day. So this was fun. I appreciate it. Awesome conversation as always.
Same here for me. Thank you so much for watching. Until the next episode, thank you very much.